One of the most important elements of any run in Hades 2 is the decision of what boons to pick up. They're all useful in their own way, but there are certainly boons that will come in more handy more often. So, to help you make some better choices, let's break down our picks for the best boons in Hades 2. First off, rather than do an outright ranking, we're going to break this down by picking out the 3 to 4 best boons per god. Also note that we're kind of taking a generalist approach here. Certain boons will be better depending on what weapon you're using and what boons you've picked earlier on in the run. So don't take these picks as absolute gospel. Secondly, we won't be covering infusion boons, chaos boons, duo boons, Daedalus hammers, Selene's hexes, or any of the NPC boons that you get like Arachne and Echo. This video is going to be purely focused on the most common boons that you can get from the 9 main gods in Hades 2. With that out of the way, let's start off with Zeus. In general, Zeus boons don't really shine bright on their own, but when you can get a bunch of them going in a single run, they can be really strong. The most universally useful boon from Zeus, in my opinion, is Storm Ring. Cast boons are generally very strong, but as far as single target damage goes, Storm Ring from Zeus is one of the best. It powers up your Omega cast by making it also have lightning strike down on one enemy at a time. This is incredibly good against bosses, as you can just drop it down, let it do its thing, or continue attacking along with it to really melt an enemy's life bar. If you're able to find this early, consider further building up your cast by taking boons that reduce its mana cost or increase its damage to really make the most out of it. Beyond that, if you're planning on going heavy on Zeus boons, look to get Heavenly Strike or Heavenly Flourish to add Blitz to your attacks, and then go for boons that synergize with Blitz like Electric Overload, which fires Chain Lightning every time Blitz procs, and Toasting Fork, which causes Blitz to deal its extra damage even without having to deal further damage to the enemy. Thunder Sprint is a mana hog, but it's another very powerful boon that causes lightning to rain down on any enemy that's near you while you're sprinting. It's a good idea to pair this with Storm Ring and really rain down the wrath of Zeus. Like in the first game, Poseidon has a combination of powerful boons that add extra damage and pushback to your attacks, along with rewarding boons that grant you an extra bonus to resources that you take outside of a run. Those are great if your goal is not to beat the game on your current run, but if your goal is to try to get further than you've been before, my favorite Poseidon boosts are Fluid Gain. As far as mana restoration boons go, Fluid Gain is pretty great as you don't really have to do anything unusual like standing still for several seconds, or standing in your cast, or sacrificing 70% of your max mana for crazy mana regen. All you have to do is land hits, and you've got a good chance to spawn bubbles that will restore a good chunk of mana. Breaker Sprint is another boon that I would recommend, which turns Mel into a watery bulldozer that's able to just plow through enemies. Weaker enemies can generally be taken out with just a single hit, making this very powerful in the early game. It is very mana hungry, so you'll need some mana restoration boons in order to keep this viable in the late game, but if you can get the support boons to make it work, Breaker Sprint can be a very strong tool to have. And then there's Wave Strike and Flourish and Slippery Slope. Don't underestimate Poseidon's basic attack and special boons. They may not add a fancy curse on the opponent, but they add a good chunk of damage, knockback, and when you also pick up Slippery Slope later, which adds the Slip Curse that deals extra damage and knockback to any enemy that gets hit with the splash, a Poseidon-focused build can start hitting like a truck. Like in the first game, Aphrodite's boons focus on 3 things: inflicting weakness on your enemies, giving you straight-up damage boosts when enemies are close, and peppering in a few health restoration boons as well. Here are the big ones that you'll want to look out for. Glamour Gain is an excellent boon for boss fights where there's only one enemy for the weakness curse to be applied to. It's straight up damage reduction with the added bonus of also giving you mana restoration as well. Regardless of what build you're going for, this is practically always a solid pickup. If your focus is on melee attacks, Flutter Strike is an easy pick. Even at the most common rarity, plus 80% damage for being close up is huge, and will be extremely noticeable in just about every type of fight. And at rare, epic, or heroic rarities, you'll be hitting extremely hard with just basic attacks. If you're running a build with a decent amount of mana regeneration, Heartbreaker is a fantastic pickup. It causes a little bomb to orbit around your character every time you spend 30 MP that deals heavy damage when it touches an enemy. It's an absolute must-have with any build where you focus a lot on Omega attacks. Apollo is a new god to Hades 2, and his boons are mostly about increasing the range of your abilities. The basic boons of Nova Strike and Nova Flourish, which increase the ranges of your attack and special respectively, will really depend on what weapon you're using, but one that will always be useful is Supernova. This is a boon that enhances your cast by making it expand its size until it expires. You should always be using your cast to limit the mobility of enemies, and your Omega cast will still do respectable damage even if you don't upgrade it all that much. But if you do decide to heavily upgrade your cast, Supernova is a must-have, as it can help clear out huge groups of enemies with just 1 or 2 Omega casts. Speaking of your casts, Apollo has one of the better Omega casts in Solar Ring. Like Zeus' Storm Ring, this one's all about damage. You drop it on the ground, wait a few seconds, and then watch life bars get deleted as several explosions go off one after the other. It's strong all throughout the game, and can be made even better by the aforementioned Supernova and other cast enhancing boons and Arcana cards. Even though I prefer Poseidon's method of regaining mana better, Lucid Gain is a pretty solid way to restore mana as well. It restores mana just by standing in your cast, allowing you to either break away from the action, drop down a cast, and restore mana safely away from enemies, or you could also restore mana in the middle of the action just by dropping down a cast and fighting with enemies while on top of it. Demeter has some of the best boons in the game thanks to the power of Freeze and the overall utility of some of her other boons. Ice Strike or Ice Flourish are always easy pickups as a way to freeze enemies, but you only need one or the other. Getting 2 boons that both afflict enemies with Freeze is a bit of a waste. The reason why Freeze is so good is because it's the only thing that can fully stop an armored enemy in their tracks. It's a bit less useful on bosses due to how shortly they remain frozen, but it's still a good thing to have. Other boons that you should look out for are Frigid Sprint. This is a fantastic sprint technique that causes a freezing cyclone to form around you that will drop down wherever you stop, giving all enemies inside frost, which slows them and any projectiles down, while also dealing extra damage per second. Combining this with Ice Strike is a great way to get the bonus from the Origination Arcana card, which gives extra damage if you attack an enemy afflicted by more than 1 curse. Best of all, it doesn't use any mana. Plentiful Forage is a boon that will give you extra max health every time you manage to find a plant, mushroom, or seed. If you're able to find this early on in a run, absolutely go for it, especially if you've also packed a shovel to dig up seeds. You'll be swimming in HP by the time you reach the final boss. Rare Crop is another boon that, if you get it early, you should absolutely go for it. It chooses a number of random boons that you already have, resets their rarity, and then every 3 encounters, it raises their rarity back up. So, after 9 encounters, you'll have at least 1 heroic rarity boon. The stat difference between rarities is substantial, much more so than increasing the level of a boon with a Palm of Power. So, anytime you're able to increase a boon's rarity, it's a huge advantage. Hephaestus is all about defense and explosions. His boons won't inflict any sort of curse on your enemies, instead they will do an explosion that deals massive damage but is on a significant cooldown after each attack. His boons are very good if you prefer a hit and run style of play. A handful that you definitely won't want to pass up on include Trusty Shield. After you enter a location, you'll prime 30 magic to gain a certain amount of shielding depending on the rarity of the boon. This pairs extremely well with Arachne's Keepsake that gives you 20 armor to start and then adds more armor every time you exit a room as long as you still have armor. The armor doesn't carry over to the next room, so if the boon gives you 20 armor, you will always have 20 armor in the next encounter, unless you got armor from another source. Ultimately, it's a safety cushion that allows for a few hits of recoverable damage at the relatively low cost of having 30 mana primed. And then there's Heavy Metal. Even at the most common level, Heavy Metal grants you 50 armor and gives you resistance to suction moves, which are some of the most annoying moves in the game. That's pretty much a no-brainer when it comes up, especially at the higher rarities, where you can get anywhere from 100 to 125 armor right away. And finally, there's Fixed Gain. You gain 10% damage resistance and also regain mana every time you get hit. If you're running a mana-hungry build, this is probably not the best boon for you, but otherwise getting passive damage reduction on top of also getting mana back is a pretty great deal. Hermes is all about speed and agility, so if you're interested in moving or attacking faster, Hermes is going to be the god you're going to want to go for. But he's also got a couple of other more utility-focused boons that are well worth seeking out. Save Breath is a boon that reduces the mana cost of your Omega cast, which is a simple but very effective boon. Omega casts are some of the best, most damaging attacks at your disposal, and if you decide to try to build heavily into them, this is definitely a boon you're going to want. And then there's Greater Evasion. Again, fairly simple here. This boon grants you a straight up boost to your dodge chance. In a game like Hades 2 where every hit you take matters, every hit you're able to avoid also matters as well. Alone, this might not seem like much, but if you're able to stack this dodge chance with the Arcana card that also increases it, Echo's boost in the third biome of the Underworld, and potentially the Wispy Wiles infusion boon from Aphrodite, you can make yourself very hard to hit. And finally for Hermes, there's also Quick Buck. Gold is very valuable in Hades 2, which is why it can often be a good idea to take this boon, especially if you can get it early, which immediately gives you 100 gold, but then also increases the amount of gold you get for the rest of the run. If you have 150 gold and you make it to Charon's shop, you're guaranteed a free boon without having to go through a fight for it. If you have more than that, you might also be able to afford a rare health restorative or a Palm of Power. If you don't have that gold, that's what you're missing out on, which can be all the difference between a successful and unsuccessful run. Hestia is a new god in Hades 2 that focuses on enhancing your abilities with Scorch. Scorch is a curse that causes damage over time to enemies. It can add up to a lot of damage, but you need to repeatedly land hits with it. And you also need to wait a long time for all that damage to take hold, so just keep those things in mind. Hestia has some great boons, including one of the best in the game, which is Soot Sprint. Soot Sprint is a must-have whenever it comes up. The ability to not only erase projectiles just by sprinting near them, but also to inflict Scorch upon the enemy that shot the projectile is just so incredibly powerful it can make many enemies and some mini-boss encounters trivial. What's even better about it is that the rarity doesn't even really matter because the real star of the boon is the ability to erase projectiles. The damage from Scorch is just a nice extra. It's just a fantastic pickup for any build. Next up, there's Burnt Offering. I normally would recommend against this boon, but it's important to know that Hestia has it, just in case you're nearing a boss with low life and you want to have a chance of restoring some health. It gives you a fairly substantial amount of life and magic, but at the cost of sacrificing a random boon. The good news is that you can see what boon it's going to get rid of before you commit to it, so you can make the decision for yourself whether it's worth it. And finally for Hestia, there is Smolder Ring. This enhances your cast to inflict Scorch on any enemies caught inside. What makes this boon great is the fact that you don't need to do an Omega cast for it. You can, and it will do even more damage, but if you're out of mana, this is a fantastic way to deal with the hordes of smaller, weaker enemies that the game likes to throw your way, especially in Oceanus. Another new god for Hades 2, Hera has some of the most interesting boons in the game. Many of them revolve around a curse called Hitch, which basically tags enemies, and when one tagged enemy gets hit, all of the other tagged enemies share damage as well. It's great for fights where there are a ton of enemies, but not so good when dealing with bosses. Still, Hera's got some other boons that aren't Hitch related that offer some great utility. Engagement Ring enhances your cast to make it last for a really long time, but more importantly, it zaps any enemies that spawn in mid-fight. This is extremely useful in certain fights where you get overwhelmed by small, weak enemies, in boss fights that summon minions to fight you while you also have to worry about the boss itself, and especially when doing timed Infernal Trove challenges that reward you with more gold if you're able to kill the enemies quickly. Just place down your cast when enemies start spawning in, and watch the life bars disappear. Born Gain makes it so that when you run out of magic, you'll instantly regain it, minus a certain amount that gets primed. This basically means that you'll never have to worry about replenishing your mana, but once you're out, you're actually out of it for the rest of the encounter. It's a price that's almost always worth paying, as not having to worry about restoring mana allows you to be a lot more liberal with your Omega moves. Going back to Hitch, if you do decide to invest in it as your main curse, you absolutely need to also pick up Dying Wish. This makes it so that once you kill an enemy with Hitch, it does damage to all other enemies that have been tagged with Hitch as well, leading to these fun kinds of popcorn moments where one enemy dying causes another enemy to die, which causes more enemies to die, etc. You will be an absolute beast when it comes to dealing with multiple enemies. And those are our picks for the best boons to get from the 9 main gods in Hades 2. Thanks for watching, and for more Hades 2, check out our review. And for everything else, keep it here on IGN.